Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the member model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $70, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members only newsletter, and more. For $140 a year, you get all of that, plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. We're in what are we? We're like 3 weeks into the new reality, I guess, as of yesterday. The new second Trump presidency reality, and I think one of the things that is happening right now is there's all of this discussion among the people who lost the election, for lack of a better word, of how do we do this differently this time? You know, we're not we're not new to this, um, and this time it's not a surprise. It's not that we were expecting this, but it's not that I you know I hope everybody went into election day knowing that this was a distinct possibility. So for most people, it is gutting, upsetting, devastating, but not necessarily surprising, or at least not shocking. And again, as I said, we've been through this before. So one of the big conversations that I'm seeing is, you know, should people approach this differently this time? And one of the things I keep seeing in you know editorials, think pieces in the papers and stuff like that, it says like, well, there's no resistance anymore, or the resistance is taking a breather, or all these kinds of things that sort of have the subtext that people are deflated or not as enthusiastic isn't the right word, but not as motivated. And I don't think that's really right. um, that may also be the case, but I think some of that right off the bat, we're gonna do marches and protests and all of these different things, kind of on day one. um, I think it's different now because people have a sense that this is a marathon, right? It's not a one day thing. I think we talked about this. Um, Kate and I talked about it. I think we talked about it on one of the episodes. Possibly it came up in sort of the pre-episode discussion. But I do think in at the end of 2016 and the beginning of 2017, the whole thing was so shocking, so absurd, so hard to believe, and seemed so I don't want to say accidental, but sort of fortuitous, a kind of a weird coming together of factors that I think a lot of people, even if they might not have thought this explicitly, had the feeling that if everybody kind of turns out at a protest and, you know, kind of does everything all at once, maybe he won't be president anymore. Like, it's so absurd. Maybe people will kind of figure out this was a mistake or an accident or something like that. Um, and clearly that wasn't the case. And I'm not saying that people, if you would have taken particular people at the time and said, do you think by doing this he might not be president in a week? I don't, it's not that I think people consciously thought that, but I think that's kind of I think it was kind of implicit or somehow in people's minds. And the fact that People know now that this is a marathon, or at least very, very different than what we had 8 years ago. Is informing that. I don't think that means that there's not going to be a very strenuous opposition to this presidency. But that's definitely one of the things that we're going to talk about in this episode: the chaos being back, the constant alarms, and what how people who don't like it are supposed to react to it, and what you can do about it, and all that kind of stuff. We're going to come back to that in a minute, but I want to mention something else, and this is still on the drawing boards, but we're pretty confident we're gonna do it. Probably do it the first time down in Washington D.C. Don't know exactly when yet, but podcasts do. It's kind of a thing. Podcasts do live podcasts, right? So I think Kate and I, at some point in the not too distant future, we're gonna do one of these, and hopefully going forward, we'll do more of them. So if you're really into the podcast, and you're in the area that we're gonna hold the first one, you can join us. We'll probably rent a venue. You can watch us and probably to some degree participate with us in a live recording of the podcast. Meet us. We get to meet you, which we'd really like to do. We interacting with our readers and listeners has always been a really big part of what we do as a news organization, and we appreciate everybody who listens to this podcast, everybody who, reads the website. So it'll be fun. Maybe we'll have an open bar. I have no idea. We're still figuring out all the details. But we think it'll be a lot of fun. We get to meet you, vice versa. You get to meet each other and, talk shop and have a good time and all that kind of stuff. So, more to come on that. Obviously, when our plans kind of solidify, we will bring you more details and everything. I think we'll have a discounts for tickets for members, all that good stuff, and we will bring you more news on that front as our plans solidify. So, but getting down to the news of the moment, what do you make of all this, Kate? This kind of like, what's the plan this time? How do people uh, uh, process the chaos and everything? How are you doing with
Oh, I'm so exhausted. Like, it's
it?
been 3 weeks, and it's just been you're immediately transported back to 2017. It's constant, it's like every hour there's a new outrage, there's a
Hmm.
new kind of unveiling of a corruption, there's a new Trump Truth Social. I mean, it's funny how kind of quickly we launched into it, even like being on the Hill, you know, working on stuff about the lame duck is hard because everyone is just projecting forward into kind of the new world order. I think in line with what you were saying last time around, kind of going hand in hand with the protests, there was this kind of universal heightened vigilance thing, and that resulted in kind of a bounty for a lot of media companies, a ton of people subscribing. I remember like just normal people in my life would watch the White House press briefings, which is like, an oddity. Um, just this feeling that like you kind of have to pay attention, and that a way to be a good citizen under a Trump regime is to hold him accountable, whatever that means, whether that be protesting, whether that be like tweeting, whether that just be paying closer attention than you otherwise would. And this time, I just think people are really tired. I think that the anti-Trump coalition feels like it's tried to kind of fend him off so much by this point that there's a sense of resignation. And I think that's kind of compounded with the usual lows that a party is brought to after they lose an election, right? And that's a particular low when it's to Trump, who did a coup. And then you've got just like really exhausting kind of rhetoric and circular conversations about what precisely is wrong with Democrats, how precisely long they'll be locked out of power. Um, and because of the way that the division happens, you've got so much scolding of Democrats, always of Democrats, right? I mean, it is kind of shocking to me the degree to which we're still in a posture where you're not even allowed to be mad at the people who voted for Trump. Like, I don't want to call him out, but there's one pollster guy who's talking. He's like, I just think it's really sad. Like, voters we know don't pay attention to future outcomes, and they're not paying attention to this stuff. And then you've got people going around saying like, enjoy the tariffs. You deserve it, kind of thing. And it's like, sorry, but are you kidding me? The anti-Trump coalition, who does pay attention and is cognizant of the danger this man poses, and the very real possibility that he will retract rights from them and people they love, don't even get to be mad at the people who can't bother to pay any attention and who are just blithely willing to put this guy back in power. You have to treat those guys with kid gloves. I mean, it's back to the let's take diner tour stuff. So I just think that mix has at least every has made everyone in my life who isn't like working in politics just in an attitude where they're not reading the news. I mean, these are people who will still know about the Matt Gaetz stuff, but who just have absolutely no appetite for the minutia right now. And, to your point, I think it's way too early to be like activism is dead. This is how oligarchs take control. They kind of like wear you out and make you cynical and defeatist. I think people are usually cynical and defeatist in the weeks after their candidate loses an election. Like, let's maybe give it a minute. But, that it is so preemptively tiring to think that we've got, at least 2 years of kind of solidified Republican power and just the Trump show every day. And I am so, so sick of him.
Yeah, I mean, I am too. I guess, I as you said, I mean, I saw, and look, I don't have any particular brief for MSNBC. I don't know what that Joe and Mika thing was about a week ago or whenever that was, when they made like a little, I don't know, pilgrimage to Mar-a-Lago or whatever. But I saw, someone sent me a link to, something about that, their audience is down by half in the aftermath of the election. And what does this mean? And blah, 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 blah. I don't think it means that much, frankly. Um, Again, we, our the traffic to TPM, to our website, is down at the moment. We're a subscription website, so that doesn't have any particular impact on us, um, you know, really at all. Um, but we're not sweating it because people are kind of, they're licking their wounds a little bit. We're going into the holidays. They're, they're bummed, they're exhausted. Um, and I think that is transitional. That's my pretty, I mean, it's my pretty strong assumption because I've been here before. I've done this for a long time. And yes, this is a different moment, but these things happen. So as you said, I'm not, if anything, I see it as, I don't see it as a positive exactly. um but I don't know, I think there's something a little healthy about it. If you get yourself really gunned up right now, um I, it's it's gonna be there. And I think there are various things that I think people should be doing, but not every person who votes Democrat around the country needs to be doing them at this moment, it's a big loss. It's a big loss. It's a small margin, but a small margin is, our politics and our elections are binary. You can lose by a single vote and the consequences are the same. And the consequences are big, you know. Um, so everybody needs to be, I don't know, kind of gentle with themselves at some level. It is exhausting. And I think a lot about um, you know, once people have sort of gotten their sea legs about the situation and getting over the shock of what happened on November 5th and everything. A, a big question is, how do you deal with that chaos? Because I mean, there's definitely a lot of people thinking, well, it's all 20-dimensional chess and everything. He does the chaos for this reason and blah 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 blah. Well, not precisely. He does the chaos because that's who he is. It's characterological, but it certainly plays a role in his system, right? And one of those things I wrote about this sometime over the last few days. Um, his shtick is that he's constantly throwing up 10 flares, right? And everybody's reacting to each flare, but he's not even going to do most of those things. Um, he's going to wait and see everybody get upset and then decide on his own time which of the things he's going to do. And so there is an aspect of dealing with this guy that is, okay, you said you were going to do this. Let's see when you actually do it. Not going to get too worked up because you say all sorts of shit. And a lot of the stuff you don't do. And when I say that, I always get a lot of people saying, "Oh, yeah, you're naive, it's going to be way worse than you think." And but I'm not saying it's going to be worse or not worse. I'm just saying that he's his shtick is to say a ton of stuff and get everyone running around in circles, even though a lot of that stuff is never going to materialize. And it's something that people have to get used to, um, being prepared, uh, being involved to weaken him in every way that is possible, but also not getting pulled into his mind games because that is exhausting. And there's just tons of lost energy, depleted energy by letting him, uh, you know, dictate everybody else's pace.
And I think there are levels to this, right? There's kind of the how do you deal with it as like a normal person? How do you kind of stay engaged without just bumming yourself out and depleting your reserves? And then there's the question of how do you deal with it if you're, for want of a better word, an elite in the party, right? Like you're helping kind of set the messaging and shoring up the ground for 2026. And I think that second one is a more difficult and interesting question because I mean the things are linked, right? You can't do a 5 alarm fire for every shitty thing he does because not going to break through, right? Like we've learned a lot about the difficulties Democrats have in getting their messages to permeate, and I think one of the obvious takeaways of that is you got to kind of pick your spots and just hammer, 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 repeat, repeat, repeat. And if you try to spread that too thin, it just nothing gets through. Um, so I think that's going to be a challenge that Democrats will face because so much of his kind of chaos of war stuff just it keeps you off balance. It to quote Steve Bannon, right? It floods the zone with shit. And I think, as you do, that Trump is not employing this as a strategic away as people often think. I just think he's a pretty, like, vain, unserious person who kind of toddles from one thing to the next. But that does create a huge kind of morass of stuff that Democrats have to choose from as underpinning the 2026 argument, the thesis statement that they're going to use. And like, we kind of already have an idea of what are going to be or kind of should be those structural underpinnings, because as you say, of all of Trump's agenda that we have no idea if he's going to do or to what extent he's going to do it, we know for sure there are going to be tax cuts, right? Like, that is something that logistically they can do pretty easily, that all Republicans of all stripes are on board for. And we know he did it last time when he had a trifecta, even when
Was
you know
was
all
kind of
the other kind of
the only thing he
exactly
did legislatively that he
right.
was able to do. Yeah,
Yeah, everything else on the agenda proved like too radioactive or too just logistically difficult. So we know he's going to do that. We know he's going to do that. Um, and if what seems to be emerging as the consensus from this election was that the atmospheric sucked because people are really grouchy about the economy, then it's kind of a natural conclusion to say, okay, so going into 26, we know that Democrats are going to be the opposition party and running as the opposition party. So a pretty kind of easy way to do it is say, yeah, Trump ran on kind of lowering inflation and cost for you, and then he went in and he gave his friends tax cuts, right? That's also, I think, a pretty easy way to do the work of transitioning Democrats back into the kind of workers party, eat the rich party. It has the knock-on effects of pointing out that Trump has surrounded himself with billionaires and CEOs. So that's an area where you got to think, Democrats strike there, they hammer that point. They really do the he's doing this for his rich friends, he's not doing this for you thing. And you would expect, that's kind of an easy through line, I think, to stick with. And there's going to be, I think, a lot more kind of picking and choosing in terms of the other stuff, right? The other stuff that voters have shown is not disqualifying to them. So, you can think of maybe the fact that everyone in his cabinet is accused of sexual assault to some degree. Like, it pains me to my absolute soul that so many people, men and women alike, have shown that they don't care about that. I think it's really one of the hardest things for me to kind of grapple with after this election. But I don't know if that's a smart place to expend a lot of energy. And sometimes it seems like it'll be a winning argument and sometimes it won't, right? Like, look, it sunk Matt Gaetz. That was a big deal. I think that showed that Trump is a lot weaker than people thought he was.
much weaker.
But then
Yeah,
you think of someone like RFK, right? His sexual misconduct stuff is a little lower grade. I mean, it's still disgusting and he's a
it's
disgusting person.
subcriminal.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
is the most accurate way to put it.
Right.
But likely subcriminal, right?
Right. But with him,
As
it's
far
like,
as
what
we
are you
know,
gonna do? Are you gonna stay with that stuff? Or are you gonna try to use him as a test case to figure out how Democrats can walk like a line where you dismiss the kooks, but you're not instinctively pro institutions that voters, rightly really distrust. So that's what I mean about the picking and choosing your battles. I think some of them is going to be really obvious, like the tax cuts. I think that's going to be a bounty for Democrats. And then some of them, there's going to be a bit more trial and error, right? To like see what's sticking and what matters to people.
I think one thing I think about a lot, and has always been something that I've sort of kept coming back to as long as I've been doing this, is that political power is unitary. You have political power, and it's the same political power that you're using abroad, on your tax policy, on your social policy, on everything. And what you draw from that is that if someone like Donald Trump is doing 10 different terrible things, you don't need to attack him on all 10 things. You can choose just one thing to attack him on, or three things to attack him on. And that doesn't mean you're ignoring those other things, because again, political power is unitary. there are, I mean, that one thing I am worried that he may actually follow through on day one is this threat to discharge approximately 15,000 trans people currently serving in the military, i.e., all the ones, kind of openly serving in the military, like on day one. I don't know that's going to happen, but my gut tells me they may feel like that's something they can do, you know, get a lot of bang for the buck out of it with their base, and that they're not going to, kind of pay a price. Um, but my larger point here is that since political power is unitary, you find the thing where you can inflict the most political damage possible, or the two or three things, because you focus on those doesn't mean you're not caring about the ones you're not focusing on as much, because again, political power is unitary. That is really, really something to focus in on. You someone's political power is all one thing. You land punches in one place, it makes them weaker for doing all the other things. And you make the point, Kate, on the tax cuts. I think that's 100% right. The additional point on the tax cuts is that they are saying very clearly now they want to pay for a lot of that out of Medicaid. Now, Medicaid historically has, in a political sense, a bad reputation. No one wants to touch Medicare because everybody gets old, and people who are on Medicare deserve their Medicare and their Social Security, which of course they do. But Medicaid is poor people, so whatever, right? Poor people, what they do wrong, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think the politics of that are different now because of this. Obamacare, ACA, is completely interwoven now with Medicaid and Medicaid expansion. So Medicaid is Obamacare. The two really cannot be separated. So I think and Medicaid expansion is also, a big reason why the number of uninsured people in this country has dropped really precipitously, not just since Obamacare, came online about a decade ago, but even over the course of the Biden administration. And something else that we have to remind ourselves of, that in the early years of Obamacare, it was a big thing for Republican states to refuse to take up Medicaid expansion. That has shifted in a lot of states over time, when even states under pretty unified Republican governance have said, why are we doing this, right? This is silly. That may have also changed some of the politics tied to Medicaid, but I'm not even concerned about that. What they are doing, the first thing right out of the gate, is going to be to give big tax cuts that go to the richest people and pay for that by taking away your health insurance. Taking away the health insurance you are getting under the Affordable Care Act. The fact that the fine print is about Medicaid, that doesn't matter, because this is real, and that is very damaging, because people don't want to lose their health insurance. So that is just, you hit that on day one, and that is, frankly, I think that's a killer politically. Look at the fact that they were never able to. That was kind of like the one legislative thing they were gearing up to do after 2016 was to repeal Obamacare, and they couldn't do it even then, and that was 8 years ago. It's like a total sacred cow now.
I think that's totally right. And all the Democratic arguments, I think, have to be put through a prism of like pretty intense individualism right now. That does seem to be the mood of the country. This, I mean, of course it is, right? It goes with a conservative swing, the sense of I, in particular, have been kind of fucked over by these recent world events. I think in some ways it's a backlash to the idea of kind of communal civic responsibility during COVID, the sense of individual sacrifice for the well being of the greater. I think we're still in a real kickback to that. So it brings me a little bit to the trans ads that Trump ran during the campaign, which I think in general there's been too much hay made of them, and it's become a really easy way for, I think, people to be like, well, trans people are the problem and we should kind of stop trying to help or protect them at all. At the same moment where the assault on them is just coming from every single corner, right? But I think to the extent that those ads were effective, and they spent a eye-popping amount of money on those ads, so they clearly thought they were getting some returns. I think it was less the trans piece and more the idea of Democrats are giving these people, maybe these weird people, stuff that I'm not getting, right? Like zero-sum game. If other people are benefiting, it's got to be to my detriment. And I think that's why, as you say, this tax stuff, the two-piece dance of the tax stuff works really well, because it's the benefit is going to rich people, not going to me. And I'm also losing stuff in the process, right? I think that is an argument that's just like well curated to this kind of dismal, introspective, nationalistic kind of moment we're in, where people are very much feeling like institutions don't serve me, the systems don't serve me. I've got to be out here kind of duking it out to get my piece of the pie.
Yeah, no, I think that is right. And the other part of those trans ads, I mean, I a couple points on those generally. I think mostly those were a base play. Those were to really rev up their committed supporters, as opposed to turning undecided voters or sort of loosely committed voters. But that tagline, which was what, he's Trump's for you, she's for, them, they, or, whatever that tagline was, there's the grossness piece of that. But there's also something more general, which is something that all successful politicians play on. It was always Bill Clinton's sort of ace in the hole when he was president and when he was in trouble politically, which was to say, I'm thinking about you. I'm really focused on the stuff you are dealing with. I have your back. I'm thinking about your stuff. And I think that look, at some level, there was a big uh, there was a big ramp up of prices under Joe Biden's term, and that just happened, and they didn't go back down afterwards, because prices never go back down afterwards. That's actually an even bigger problem. But that happened, and to a certain extent, everything that we kind of add on to that happened is kind of superfluous. It's just that happened, and the Democrats paid a price for it. But I think where some of the social stuff starts playing is if prices are going up and Joe Biden is out there saying stuff and doing whatever, you're like, dude, what about the prices? So people become very susceptible to, maybe that's just not his focus. Maybe he's just thinking about trans people all day. And so there's two different, it's worth seeing that there's two different things going on there. When people feel ignored, they're very susceptible to messaging that basically says you're being ignored because you're just not the priority. They care more about this other stuff, this other thing. Um, that's not exactly the same thing as hating. It's related to it. I'm not justifying it, but again, uh, what you need to be sure is you need to convince voters that you have their back to the things they really care about. And when you do that, you have um, you have more leeway and credibility to the things that they may not care as much about. Like, and I think the reality is in this country, I think there's a big major I think there is a sizable majority that doesn't care that much about trans people one way or another. In the sense in which that's kind of good. Trans people doesn't the fact that there are trans people living their lives doesn't doesn't hurt you. It's not a problem to you. It just, you live your life, they live their lives, whatever. Um, so that, and in a sense, that is, there was that Adam Gentleson article in the Times that got so much play, and it has been, um, I think, not totally accurately, um, looped into that anti-groups, anti-trans, um, conversation. I don't think that's completely accurate. I mean, I think, but you know, Adam has only to blame himself to blame if he feels looped into that. But I think at the most generous, the argument he was making is you need to get into power first and solidify your power. And once you're in power, you can do all sorts of good things, but you need to get in power first. So I don't know. There's a lot. I don't know how clear that was, but I think all of that stuff is worth thinking through, and you need to have the majority of voters feel like you really care about the things that matter to them.
This is a good segue to what we wanted to talk about, which is this. It's become known as the group's discourse in short, which basically summarizes a popular kind of talking point from the left after the election, which is Democratic politicians are too enthralled to these lefty groups of various kinds, whether that be kind of trans activists or immigration activists or what have you. And that has helped speed them along this path of like college speak and alienating normal people, and perhaps most importantly, forcing politicians to adhere to litmus tests that then kind of come around and bite them later. I mean, this is the leftist version of the right's primary problem, that you get pushed so far to the left during the primary that when you try to kind of uh, soften the edges in the general, there's this like wealth of oppo research for Republicans to kind of pick from. And I have a lot of thoughts on this, a lot of issues with it, but I think one way where Jenelson and co, I think, are pretty unobjectively correct is that groups have got to stop demanding these litmus tests in particularly on camera forms. Like the leadership of the Harris campaign went on Pod Save America yesterday for their first interview since the election, the what went wrong election. And they were talking a little bit about the trans ad and how they tested all these rebuttals or explanations, and they didn't do well, in part because she's on camera saying, yeah, this is what I support, and that is like really hard to refute. And I think from that angle, yeah, Democratic politicians got to stop saying yes to that stuff on camera, and got to stop, for the love of God, filling out questionnaires. There's no reason to kind of put such low hanging fruit in the Republicans path. However, that being said, that's a lot of an easier argument than I think what's really happening, which is they don't need a Democratic politician to say it. Like, we've seen this play out a million times. The extremists on the right are like in the House of Representatives. The extremists on the left are like a student group at Berkeley, and whatever they're talking about, the right will, in total bad faith, in a way that also gets replicated in the media, just be like, and that is the Democratic position, despite no quote unquote kind of mainstream Democrat or any Democrat with appreciable power ever taking that position, right? I mean, this is kind of what happened with defund the police. Like, that was an activist slogan. Were these activists left leaning? Yeah, but are we going to go on like 8chan and see what right wing activists are saying and kind of make that the platform of the Republican Party? This is an asymmetry which happens to Democrats all the time because of both the right wing media machine and because the mainstream media's insistence on both sidesing and having equally crazy things to balance on both sides mean that you elevate these really fringy left positions and hold them opposite to what is kind of the mainstream Republican platform and be like, well, kind of nutsos on both sides, you know? So I'm like a little bit wary about this idea of if Democrats avoid saying easily, you know, lampoonable shit, this won't happen to them again. Because I feel pretty confident that the right will just find some kind of like left wing person on Twitter and be like, see, the Democrats think that all men should be in jail. So what about that?
Yeah, the first thing I think about this is that this is a conversation within the Democratic Party that goes back literally decades. We talk a couple cycles ago, super delegates were the big thing, right? Now, what is the origin of the superdelegate? The origin of the superdelegates is that after the 1970s, with the new primary system and the kind of democratized primary system with primaries and caucuses, no smoke-filled rooms and stuff like that, coming out of 1980 and then 1984, the sort of institutional Democratic Party said these groups are killing us. They're creating a system where the primaries produce these presidential candidates that are too left wing to win nationally. So we are going to create super delegates, and what those are the idea was they're governors, they're members of Congress, they're party chairs, they're people whose interest is in winning, not in having the perfect score from the ACLU. And that's how we're going to kind of get control of this thing again, and not have presidential candidates who are controlled by the groups. I mean, literally, that was how we got super delegates, right? The institutionalist thing. So this conversation has been going on forever. It is in a lot of ways it is inherent to the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party is two things. First of all, it's a coalition party, and people need to be reminded all the time that the Democratic Party is a coalition party in a way that the Republican Party is not. Yes, there's a Republican coalition. It has some different factions and stuff like that. But for basically forever, the Republican Party is dominated by conservative, affluent Christians. And today, even more sort of conservative, affluent Christian men. Okay. Now, there are other groups. There are people who don't fit all those check boxes in the Republican Party. But if you're a Republican, you're living in the affluent conservative Christian house. You're a guest in their house, and they call the shots, right? There's no similar group like that in the Democratic Party. That's why it's always so silly when different people are calling themselves the base. There is no base of the Democratic Party. There's no dominating group. The closest you get to kind of arguably a dominating group is African Americans, especially African American women, but African Americans. But there is no dominating groups. You're always going to have this thing of needing to cobble together a lot of different groups, and having a party that is more fissurable. It comes apart easier, because it's that kind of coalition in a way that it doesn't on the Republican side. Because again, if you're a gay Republican, if you're an African American Republican, if you're a Jewish Republican, you're living in someone else's house, right? So some of this is just how it is, and it's something that has to be managed. I think that um, there's just some basic things that you have to. It's what you said. Not everybody has to fill out a checkbox for every last thing you've thought about. You just need to know if someone is on the right side of that issue, and there are smarter ways to litigate these things. But the other thing about the Democratic Party too is, and it's sort of about with gay marriage. Gay marriage was same sex marriage was brought into the political sphere through the Democratic Party. And it was difficult for the Democratic Party because at the beginning, it was really unpopular. Clear majorities of the public were against same-sex marriage. And it was a big electoral issue 20 years ago. We know all this, and now we all feel great. Democrats feel great that sort of we're the party who made this happen, but it wasn't easy. We lost some elections over it, and some of that again is kind of the party we are. And there's a degree, I saw some people in that whole kind of groups debate saying, hey, from now on we never back anything that is not popular with all important constituencies. I mean, good luck with that. Good luck. That's not realistic. And people say it's not courageous. I'm not big into courage. I'm just big into things that don't happen. Like, things don't fly up, they fly down, right? So yeah, I think it's what you say. You don't need to force everybody to kind of say a bunch of things on camera that are not popular, because a lot of things that are right are not popular. And there's tons of things that Republicans believe that are terribly unpopular, obviously.
Right. And I think you can do some work with this on the margins, right? It's the don't say unpopular things on TV. It's the maybe kind of like learn to lay off your own candidate a little bit. An interesting thing that the Harris campaign people said in that interview were the she won't do interviews thing that really permeated out to people and made people think that she was like kind of hiding and too scared to do this stuff, which I think juxtaposed really unflatteringly with Trump doing all these podcasts and kind of going on places that presidential candidates wouldn't have in the past. And to some degree, it's like, well, okay, a lot of that was coming from like CNN, right? The mainstream media. And there's absolutely nothing Democrats can do about that. But,
That's also kind of their job. They want
yeah,
interviews, and that's kind of just natural.
but
Yeah.
that it was also coming from inside the House, right? That was coming from other Democrats too. And it's just a fact that I think goes along with the coalitional nature. Republicans won't do that to their candidate ever. They realize that it would weaken them and they don't do it. And that's where I think some of this, as you say, is just unavoidable. It's just the fact of being this kind of party. And in some ways, it's a lot easier to be a more homogenous party like the Republicans are. But for Democrats, they just, I think, need to get more comfortable with what I think Gentleson was right about, the idea that you need to grab and wield power. And that's something Republicans have always been much more comfortable with. And Democrats tend to be in this attitude of like not ruffling feathers, doing things in a way that doesn't get them yelled at. And we see the more pernicious effects of that in Congress, especially, right? And in Merrick Garland's DOJ, and in ways that I think have redounded to making Democrats look weak and mushy and like they stand for nothing. And if that is coming from this concern about treading lightly and not angering people, like it's having the exact kind of opposite effect that it should. But I think that's a little bit less about like be less nice to the ACLU. Like, yeah, sure, protect your candidate where you can, right? But like nobody, I think, thought that Biden was pandering too much to lefty groups, right? Like, even though he had a very progressive legislative record, normies certainly don't know or think that. Like, he reads as a moderate, and kind of all the data points we have were that he would have gotten murdered in this election in a way worse than she did, right? So to some degree, it just feels a little bit like window dressing to me. Like the centrists are kind of getting their rocks off by punching left, like they do, right? Like, I mean, we've seen this story before, but the thing is, like, okay, how do you emerge from it with like a actionable plan, kind of going forward? And as you say, that simply can't be Democrats being like, well, Republicans don't have to care about minority groups, so we're done with that. Like, it's central to the party's identity, right? You can't get rid of that stuff. So I think and I also am just like a little bit, makes me raise my eyebrows, this idea of like they're too supportive of like niche kind of group requests, because I also don't think normies really know about those either. So I think you need to find a way to have someone read as I'm kind of here for the working class people, but I'm not mean. I'm kind of like, you do your thing, whatever. Like finding a way to kind of package that in a person. And that is something I'm still kind of fiddling over every day because I don't think there's a clear answer there. And I think a lot of the examples we keep being given are like, the woman with the many names in the rural Washington district, or Jared
Yep.
Golden, these people who were like, well, she only talked about the health of that lake in Washington, and he only talked about, like, I don't know, lobster restrictions or whatever. And it's like, okay, sweet. Like, that's great if you only have to run in like a small house district, and people want to talk to you about, like, I don't know, coastal erosion or whatever is like important in your little idiosyncratic corner of the world. That's not exactly instructive for people who are running nationwide and can't be like, no, I hear you. Your potholes are super important to me, right? Like, there's got to be a way to kind of eh, just expand on that theory or make it kind of doable on a national level. And I just keep coming back to the question of like, do these internecine things matter at all? Like, was Obama preternaturally gifted at balancing group interests with appearing economically populist enough that normies don't get turned off? Or was he a compelling, exciting, dare I say, cool figure that all these people could kind of project onto what they wanted, and that helped him to be like a big unifier? Like, what was his refrain? Hope and change, right? Okay, that's pretty vague, right? You can kind of read into that whatever you want. And so I don't know. I'm ending without a clear thesis statement, but like, this is it's so easy to like find the weaknesses in these various here's what went wrong, here's what we have to fix arguments because of just the unwieldy nature of the Democratic Party. But it's also really hard for me to kind of sketch out a projection of how to fix things in the future because I actually don't think there were any really clear missteps here. And I sometimes wonder, is this just a matter of like, you need a candidate who kind of matches the moment, and if the atmospherics are bad enough, you're not going to win anyway, and then that's where you are.
One thing that I think is, with again the woman out in Washington State whose name I can never
It's
precisely remember.
it's
It's like
three names.
Perez.
We should
Yeah,
say her name. It ends with
yeah,
Perez, and it's Glucin something in the middle. Okay,
Glusenkamp or something.
yeah, Marie Glusenkamp Perez. There it
Okay, all
is.
right,
Three
that's
names
her.
Marie.
Right. Yeah, we're all for you, Marie. With her, with Jared Golden up in Maine, no one. God, now I'm forgetting the previous governor of Maryland, the Republican governor of Maryland, who just lost
Oh,
the Senate race.
Larry. What's his last name? Hogan. Larry Hogan.
Yeah, Larry Hogan. No one. I mean, sometimes Democrats say this, but no one thinks like, "Wow, Larry Hogan. Republicans need to run with that Larry Hogan program." I mean, that's silly. The people who win. Every party needs people who can, the way that John Tester did until this cycle, who can win in areas that are very marginal for their party. But by definition, they have to kind of DIY it a bit, right? Kind of come up with their own like kind of special mix of things. They're never going to be the path forward for the whole party. That's silly. Um, eh, another thing I always try to remind myself is every losing campaign is stupid. Every losing campaign is stupid. People are unable to think, you know what, we ran a really good campaign and we lost. That's a that's sad, and it is sad, but that happens a lot. Um, just because you lost does not mean you did everything wrong. So that is a big thing to for everybody to internalize. But I think the basic thing you have to do is you need to have the center point of your conversation being things that apply to kind of everybody or most people, right? And you don't necessarily front the things that don't have as wide a constituencies, not because you don't care about them as much, but because you're trying to win an election. And the other thing about when what you were saying before was, not being so worried that you're going to be criticized or something like that. I think it even goes beyond that. And I do think this is something Gentleson was getting at. Democrats don't just want to win an election, they want it to be beautiful. They want it to be an election we can all feel good about. Well, why? That should be really far down the list. You just need to win the election. You don't want to do terrible things. You don't want to, um, uh, hurt people. But really, you just want to win the election. And win the election should be the kind of the first, second, and third thing. And then once you win the election, you can do all the good stuff. Again, I think that was a big part of, uh, you know, Adam knew the conversation he was getting into. So I don't think he's being like mistreated or anything, but I know Adam. He's a pretty smart guy and a good guy. And I think this is kind of was in a lot of ways the thrust of what he was saying. The other thing that I think is a real opportunity for Democrats is that the billionaires really came out of the closet in this election, right? I mean, really, really. The issue has always been in the past, well, we need to do X, Y, and Z and not just take care of the rich people. Well, who's rich? You make $300,000 a year, are you rich? $500,000, depending on where you live. What's rich? Certainly anybody making $500,000 doing pretty good. But are they rich? Politically, these things start to matter. But the billionaires have really kind of, like I said, really kind of come out of the closet. They're all for Trump, like all for Trump. There are some exceptions, but organized wealth, the level of wealth that is just you and I never going to get there. And it's such a small and just even the way that you have all of, or at least a lot of the most vocal Silicon Valley billionaires either really getting behind Trump or wanting to be friends with Trump, right? So that really opens, I think, an opportunity for Democrats to be saying, we want the kind of the average person to be free to live a dignified life. That means you can go to the grocery store and you don't come back with indigestion because it's so nerve-wracking because you're spending so much money. You have a hope you're going to, be able to buy a home. You can have health insurance. You don't have to not have health insurance. And like, you take all those things that make, it's not that everybody's going to be rich or everybody's going to get everything they would like in like to have in their heart of hearts, all that kind of stuff, but a dignified, fair life, right? And that's where the Democratic Party should be. And again, the billionaires have kind of opened themselves up by kind of like, wow, they're all for Trump. They just want their tax cuts and they want to own everything. That's an opening that the Democrats have not always had.
Totally. Just to kind of put a bow on this, that I think if there's one thing Democrats, I really hope that they do take out of this conversation, it's that they need to get more ruthless. And that doesn't mean throwing vulnerable people under the bus, but it does mean, I'm thinking kind of Fetterman pre whatever happened to him when he got into Congress and now he's kind of pissed off everybody. But I think some of the reason people liked his campaign so much is that he was really unapologetic about stuff, and that included, flying a pride flag from the lieutenant governor's mansion, like that included then things like marijuana legalization and, a real interest in criminal justice kind of stemming from being mayor of a, somewhat kind of troubled, area. And I think there was just a sense where he liked making fun of Republicans. He didn't apologize. He didn't tiptoe. He never used kind of consultant language. And like all of this added up to this big like folk hero status. But I just think there are lessons to be learned that can more easily be nationalized, you know? And part of that was just he wasn't embarrassed, you know? He didn't kind of it didn't seem like he was calculating every step and weighing kind of what the backlash would be. And I think that is what people are kind of getting at when they're doing the whole like Democrats talk like faculty lounges thing. Like Republicans are the doing the coup on the government one. You know, you don't have to pretend like that, oh, you know, we're not perfect, you know, we got to iron things out. Like no, stand up, man. You know, like kind of be proud that you're the party that cares about like poor people and minorities and working people, and that they're out there to kind of serve patrician interests with this really easily pierceable veil of economic populism, faux economic populism, which is also kind of just a mask for like various bigotries, and just like, you know, run with that. And I think ruthlessness is just something the Democratic Party should embrace from every angle. And if that's kind of, I hope that is something that gets into the mix more than just the classic kind of, you know, shitting on various like minority identity groups that are, you know, trying to protect people.
Well, the other thing too is I think what's important about that sort of politics that we want everybody to be free to live a full life and a dignified life. And when you come to trans people, why does the Democratic Party support trans people? Because everybody deserves to live a free and dignified life. Everybody. And it's not like why don't trans people get that too? Everybody deserves to live a free and dignified life. And that's a politics that I think brings a lot of things together, and it's one that actually the Harris campaign was kind of flirting with. You know, the
Mhm.
sort of the rhetoric of freedom. It's one that Pete Buttigieg, before he became kind of a national figure, was talking about a lot. And yeah, you know, the whole, this is something we've talked about a lot, but there is just something with the mainstream media's relationship with the Democratic Party that Democrats all just constantly need to have reckonings and think about where they fall short and think about this, that, and the other. And that's just not something that anybody else has to think about, or even the kind of the constant rhetoric we know about how, you know, looking down on people from the middle of the country. I mean, listen to how Republicans talk about Democrats, like freaks and disgusting people and weirdos and
Pedophiles.
pedophiles. I mean, the imbalance of this of that sort of set of assumptions about how politics works is unreal, unreal. I mean, again, Republicans talk about cities as violent hellholes with, you know, full of deviants and perverts, and not even the good kind, right? So, you know, give us a break. As you said, the Democrats, you know, not everybody's going to agree that Democrats are the good guys. But if you believe in the things that Democrats believe in, big picture, there's plenty to feel good about. So yeah, more ruthless, more focused, and you know, so a lot of this stuff is like I was emailing with a reader a few days ago about this person was you know, very upset about the group's trans conversation that was going on certainly a couple weeks ago. Um, and I said to them, like, it sucks, but like it's like 10 days after the election. Everybody's really upset, and like they're venting and trying to figure out what's going on. And I'm not defending it, but like there's- give it a little time. You know, people need a while to say stupid things, and not all of it's stupid. You got to be smart. You know, that whole thing about the, you know, the sort of the trans prisoners or trans prisoners in like ICE custody. You know, you have a thing that was act like, as people were pointing out during the election, and sort of like when it hardly matters, that kind of like it's already law. No one's even paying attention to this one. It's already federal law. So like, why are we even getting people to sign on for it? Like, it's it's the status quo. No one's paying attention. So like, what was the point there? See, you got to be smart in a way that is not about abandoning groups that because you're in a tizzy and you think that's why you lost an election. And again, I mean, look, there are um well, there's a whole conversation about how specific ways about how um trans politics seemingly became very central in democratic politics over the last few years, and were certain issues kind of pushed to the forefront sooner than other, whatever. I think that Democrats have to be smart, but they're not going to stop being the party that is the venue in which the evolution of rights takes place. That's why the civil rights movement was basically something that happened within the Democratic Party. Gay rights was something that happened within the Democratic Party. Some of that is just kind of how it is, and there's ways to be smarter, but some of that is just how it is, part of being a Democrat. Yeah. So before we finish up, just one housekeeping note I wanted to mention, because we are all departing now for Thanksgiving. The video version of this episode will not be available till the week after Thanksgiving. So the audio one will come up at the normal pace, but that one will come later. I want to wish everybody have a great Thanksgiving. If you're listening to this before Thanksgiving in the next 24 hours or so. And I think that is all we have for this episode. Anything else?
Nope, that's it.
All right, later.
See you next week. The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.